glad you can join me today for some discussion on Glacier decks. But first, you can't talk about Glacier without talking about ice. And you can't talk about ice without talking about icebreakers. So let's start off by analyzing the situation with icebreakers in New Age Netrunner. Now, with the rotation and ban list, all of the cheesy breakers that we used to know have been banned or restricted in some way, shape or form. No more Parasifer to insta-kill your ice. No more Faust to waltz through all your ice very easily with just one install. And certainly no way of bypassing your ice with cheesy combos like DDoS False Echo. This means that most of the remaining solutions to ice require money to use, just as original Netrunner, core Netrunner I should say, intended. The problem is, runners are pretty poor right now. As you know, the economy got gimped pretty hard. So what actually happened is that most icebreakers become pretty untenable due to being too expensive and not having enough money, the combination of both. So what are the best breaker suites of this day and age? I consider the Stealth suite to be a solid tier 1 breaker suite simply because it's so cheap to use. For 1 credit you get to pump 3 strength on Refractor, 5 strength on Dagger, and with Paperclip you can efficiently break most barriers. And all this is supported by Divey for those all those ice that cannot be dealt with regular breaker suites. So yes, the Smoke breaker suite is incredibly strong, and this is why you see a proliferation of Smoke around JNet and the meta just recently. Another very strong breaker suite comes in the form of a primary AI breaker, Ormaquah. Ormaquah is incredible because you're paying 1 credit per subroutine. If I could pay 1 credit to break each subroutine on every single piece of ice, I would be a very happy runner. Of course, strength is a limitation, but there are cards like Data Sucker and the Enlister to support Ormaquah. Total is a very powerful card, and there are very few ice that can stand in its way. Another important breaker suite to note is the Conspiracy breaker suite. Now this isn't the most efficient breaker suite. In fact, Black Orchestra and MK Ultra, 3 credits minimum to break their respective ice is pretty crap. That being said, it is the only breaker option left for Anox, and its efficiency comes in the form of being cheap to install and installable from the bin. So whatever costs you pay for breaking ice is kind of mitigated by the fact that they have clickless installs and they are not that expensive to install. Not also that they cause no influence in the Anox faction. So this is something important to note. Most Anox that you'll see will be running this breaker suite. So with all these breakers considered, what sort of ice is best positioned to deal with this these so-called competitive breakers? Well, first thing you can do is to go for ice that have lots of subroutines. And when I say lots, I mean lots. 3 subroutines don't make the cut nowadays. So the problem with all these breakers that we've seen, especially the Stealth breaker suite, is that they only have a 1-to-1 credit to subroutine breaking ratio. So the more subroutines you have, the better the ice will be. I'm thinking of stuff like Tour Guide and Ashigaru. Unfortunately, these are paired with degenerate decks, you know. You're thinking of Gagarin Acid Spam or Uninteractive CI. You have to play those decks in order to get these powerful ice. So that's a bit of a bummer. Hive is another interesting way of doing things, and it's something that I've been advocating recently. It allows you to score early agendas very easily, and it's very difficult for runners to contest it. 5 to break with a Paperclip that costs 4 to install is pretty good. Now the exception to this is in the mid to late game. If you're up against something like a Smoke that installs Divey, you will be in trouble. You can't lean on these ice to keep the runner out. Force the runner to pay upwards of 10 credits to break each subroutine. That just isn't going to happen when they have Divey installed, because Divey, you pay 2 stealth credits, you break all subroutines. So that is a weakness you have to keep in mind. What other ways are there to deal with these icebreakers? Unholy Strength is one. Yes, this is quite possible, because if we go back to the Ormaquah breaker suite, we realize that this is the Achilles heel of Ormaquah. If the turtle doesn't have enough strength, it cannot break ice, period. However, this is mitigated by the fact that in the same meta you have Smoke, which deals with high strength ice very easily. Dagger and Refractor pump strength so efficiently. Again, their pumping ratios are ridiculous. 1 stealth credit gets you 3 or 5 strength. So code gates and high strength code gates and sentries are out of the option. But what about high strength barriers? I'm thinking Seder adaptive barrier alongside a very vertical server, or a priority construction firewall. Instant 8 strength ice on your remote. Those will severely tax out paperclip for not very expensive cost, and that's quite important because the game might be pretty fast nowadays. Chiyashi is a bit slow. 12 credits to res, very expensive for most corps nowadays. Special mention goes out to DNA Tracker. Even though it's not a barrier, so it can be easily broken by Refractor, one must take note that 6 strength is an awkward region for sentries and code gates to be, because 1 pump of Refractor and Dagger gets them both to 5 strength. So any 6 strength ice is automatically that much more taxing for smoke to deal with. So DNA Tracker, honorable mention there. So with these ice in mind, let's build a Glacier deck. So Seder adaptive barrier, Prycon firewall, yeah, I think this looks like a Wayland deck. And then we splash in DNA Trackers and boom, this is our Glacier deck. We are playing it out of BABW because we need the money to res and install all these expensive ice. The game plan is rather simple. As with most Wayland decks, you start off by rushing 2 to 4 points behind end runs early. This is pretty standard and is easily doable because you have an agenda in Oaktown renovation that easily lends you to increase your tempo as you score agendas. I can't stress enough how good of an agenda Oaktown is. Once you get up to match point, 4 points is generally where I consider match point to be, you set up for the late game. You ice up centrals so that you won't get cheesed out of indexings or apocalypses or legworks or the like, and then you start building a ridiculous tower on your remote. Take note that priority construction easily allows you to do this by mitigating the install cost and gives you 3 advancement counters on your advanceable ice to boot. You can even manually advance your remote ice to every single advancement on that firewall is 1 more credit a paperclip needs to pay. And as you all know, paperclip is the top tier barrier breaker nowadays. No one's playing any barrier breakers other than paperclip. Cerberus Lady is an honorable mention, but again, that is 1 strength to pump, 1 credit to pump 1 strength. So same deal. Finally, you keep jamming stuff in remote. We are playing jammy Wayland here. Jam something, they are forced to run it, because if they don't run it, it could be a Project Atlas that gives me 2 more points. It could be even a global food that auto wins me the game when I'm on 4 agenda points. If you don't check it, I'll play my one-off Red Planet Couriers to win the game. Finally, the way in which you tax them, I mean, imagine they pay like upwards of 5, 7, maybe even 10 credits to get all the way, blast their way through the Never Advanced Remote, only to find that it's a 4 to trash public support that they couldn't afford to trash. That is the best feeling, and that is our remote bait. Public support is a card that's a win-win for us. Either they don't run it and you gain 1 agenda point, or they do run it and they lose a lot of tempo that way, allowing you to actually jam out another of your real agendas. So, Jammy Wayland, more like a Glacier deck. Let's give it a shot. Today we are up against legendary runner James Gray with his signature smoke. So immediately I knew I had absolutely no room for error, given how well he knows smoke inside and out. So with this opening hand, it's very marginal. It has the ice you need early on, but not fast enough. No money, only an Oaktown, which I can't really push out early because turn 1 needs to be spent guarding centrals. We don't want to be victim to a turn 1 indexing. So I start off with a pretty standard opening of green level into 2 ice on centrals. Green level helps power up this deck so much, gives you the forward tempo you need to find those cards that can help defend your centrals and your remote. So now I actually have a buffet of options in terms of what remote ice I want. Click 1 is going to be a draw here because I need to see more options, and I see the Prycon. So theoretically I could have played Pry Construction into an ice on the remote this turn, but I chose not to, because good Glacier play dictates that ideally your innermost ice should have an end run on it. You want to Prycon the Colossus, not the Spiderweb, because Spiderweb doesn't do anything with extra counters. But Spiderweb is the end run ice, Colossus is not. So my base ice for Spiderweb, so you see some gameplay decisions there. This is turn 3 for me, and ideally at this point I would actually have jammed an agenda in the remote. As I mentioned in the video, even though this is a Glacier deck, you want to be pumping out agendas early because your scoring window closes incredibly quickly nowadays. So ideally, that turn 3 would have been Prycon Colossus into install Atlas in the remote, but I have not drawn a single agenda yet, let alone the Project Atlas I was looking for. Turn 4, it's time to score an agenda. No agenda. Public support is fine, but this is not a card I want to score in the early game. Early game should be spent scoring big agendas, 2-point agendas, not trivial public supports. Public support is meant to be used as never advance bait in the late game. So you can see the sweat rolling off my eyebrow as I enter turn 4 without any agenda threats in sight. As my opponent begins assembling the rig with SMC, I knew my window was closing very quickly. Turn 5, still no agenda. Finally, the Oak Town I was looking for. Install, advance. We are going to score this Oak Town. I'm pretty sure my opponent's not going to contest it, but this might just be too late. I'm only one agenda that, yeah, I'm still far off from my goal. I still need more agendas. Turn 6, I score the Oak Town. My opponent goes for an indexing while I was caught off guard. I guess this was my mistake. I should have double ice R&D instead of dedicating the third piece of ice to the remote. I had to be doubly sure. My opponent had an SMC. During that turn, they could have slapped some breakers down and run the remote. You never know. So indexing comes down, and surely they get something off the indexing here. The worst part about this indexing is that it actually controls my later turns. I know full well there are no agendas in my hand. So if my opponent indexes here and finds agendas on R&D, well, they won't be there for me. I will not have access to agendas for the next couple of turns, and this is big bad news. My opponent did not rerun R&D, implying there are no agendas on top of R&D in the 5 cards there. This is terrible. I'll have to go for the next 2 or so turns without scoring. At this point, I'd much rather drag my opponent through my remote than through my R&D because my remote's way more taxing. You see the Colossus there, triple advance. So here I tried to drag my opponent through the remote, but I failed. They did not take the bait, so I had to settle for the public support, giving me 1 point. I purged counters here because Tapworm is going to cause me a lot of trouble in the late game. I know I can't really tax out smoke, so I need to keep the economy down, but at this point, Tapworm is too much to handle. They've gotten too many ticks off it, and now they're going to start running my HQ using those stealth credits and those 20 credits they now have. Peace in Your Time is a really good card. While it gives me a lot of money myself, the money matters more for my opponent who is trying to repeatedly run my servers. Alright, I draw into more money, which is not very useful now because obviously I don't really need the money. I'm not scoring agendas yet. I'm spending my turns purging virus counters because I knew there would be no agendas on top of R&D anyway. So, purge, and my opponent gets another SATCon down. This is horrible. They spend 1 click to install a SATCon, I spend 3 clicks clearing the SATCon. This isn't going to work out long term. I draw into a Crisium Grid. Okay, this is something. This can stop the indexings for now. I take 1 more draw with green level and I see the Atlas I need. So the Atlas goes in the remote. I hope my opponent doesn't check it here. Escher! Oh, haven't seen that card in a while. Wow. FML, really FML. Now, he had the potential to really screw over my ice placement, but thankfully, from my perspective, it wasn't too bad. The Marumati got displaced, which is always a pity. You want it on HQ, but otherwise, at least Satyr Barrier is still on the remote. So, my opponent still has to deal with a Strength 5 Satyr. No Colossus to stop them though. Although at this point, against smoke, Colossus really isn't the best size. I was looking for the Firewall, I didn't find it, I had to settle for the subpar Colossus. So, my opponent does fetch the Atlas, unfortunately. Huge pity. Okay, Firewall, a bit too late, but if I can find a priority construction, the Firewall will go on the remote. Hey, I found the priority construction. Archive memories into Prycon Firewall. Perfect. Okay, this should make my server a lot more unpalatable to my opponent. Now all I have to do is to find an agenda and jam it into the remote. Can I find the agenda? Nope, it's a hedge fund. Great, let's draw. Nope, still not an agenda. Can we try again? Or do I want to install the Satyr on the remote? I am pretty rich after all, so I can definitely afford to do this, and I will. I'm going to make this look like an Atlas. This looks suspiciously like an Atlas. Jamming it in there and then placing an ice on it on the same turn as the 5th piece of ice on the remote. That has to be an Atlas, right? Nope, my opponent says, I call your bluff. I'm going to run R&D here. It looks all the more tempting since there's an upgrade on it that's probably Crisium Grid that they know about. So they break the 2 DNA trackers for 10 credits, which they have, well, yeah, their credit supply is endless. At this point with Netmerker, stealth isn't a concern, and with their loads of cash thanks to Peace in Our Time. They could definitely afford to run Trash the Christian Grid and go in for an indexing if they so wish to. But first, they use a turning wheel to fetch an armored Cerberus. The game balked out here. My opponent got 1 access when they should have gotten 3, thanks to multi-access with turning wheel, so I'm gonna let them rerun. But yeah, they're starting to steal the agendas that I never saw when I needed them most. Really, in this matchup, I needed the agendas to be my hand. I had HQ protected with Merumati early on. If the agendas were in my hand, I would have such a better time because my opponent didn't really run HQ, and I could just continuously pump them out in the remote. And at the very least, force my opponent to get taxed through my very taxing remote, and at best, I would get to score those agendas myself. So you see how a bad draw causes me to be in a very bad position. If I found the Project Atlas turn 3, I would be on 5 agenda points right now. My opponent would be forced to run the remote. Threatening match point is so crucial. Instead, they can now take their pick. They can leisurely ignore my remote while pressuring R&D to the fullest. They know that I'm not top decking agendas of R&D. I try my best here to pretend that the agenda in the remote is actually Project Atlas by not rezzing the public support in there, but my opponent still doesn't fall for it. They go for the indexing into R&D. I think that's probably game. There's nothing I can do to stop this. I did not draw any more ice. I dedicated all my ice to the remote, which my opponent never ran, save for that one time they fetched my Atlas. Very well played by my opponent, and this is the sort of shaper I enjoy. Aggressive shaper that punishes your centrals instead of just camping remotes, waiting for you to jam stuff in remotes. This is the kind of shaper I enjoy, and yeah, didn't feel too bad to be beaten by the best of Smoke players. Not to take away from James Gray, who played a pretty much flawless game, as expected, but I got a pretty unlucky draw this game. Even though it seemed like I was chugging along nicely, I never really encountered money problems, thanks Peace in Your Time, and I seemed to find a lot of ice that I needed for a Glacier deck. But I didn't see the key cards I needed. Agendas needed to come early, because against Smoke, you need to rush out. What happened was that the agendas were all stuck in the bottom half of R&D, allowing my opponent to easily pick them off with multi-access in the mid to late game. I also saw the wrong ice early. Colossus, while a very good synergistic card with priority construction, was not the correct candidate against Smoke. It is incredibly effective against the likes of Anarchs. MK Ultra is just not gonna cut it against Colossus, but against Smoke, Dagger breaks it for a mere 4 credits, 2 of which are stealth. That's not good. A Firewall, on the other hand, would have cost 7 regular credits to break. Not that it mattered, because my opponent played a perfect Escher to ruin my plans. Very, very well played. Also, James Gray basically guessed every single one of my never advanced games correctly. Twice, I slammed a public support in the remote and he didn't flinch. Which is suboptimal. You want your opponent to run the public support and be forced to trash it even before you get to res it. Whereas, when I did decide to go for the Never Advanced Atlas, my opponent called my bluff on it, going for the Escher turn. That was huge for my opponent, denying me match point then. So all in all this led up to my opponent winning by a landslide. I never got to match point, and my opponent had me on lock. Yep, that was it. Still, this should not deter you from playing the deck. This basically screams core Netrunner. You make big money, you install big ice, and you score agendas the old-fashioned way. If you are trying to introduce someone who has played Netrunner before but quit the game, or maybe a relative newbie who has played a couple of games, this would be a perfect training deck, or a deck to give them to get up to speed. It has some new mechanics from later cycles, most notably priority construction, allowing the construction of insane remote ice, as well as some cool cards like Red Planet Couriers for fun, while maintaining the core essence of Netrunner in money and ice and scoring agendas, and forcing your opponent to lose tempo to check remotes, that sort of thing. If you want to copy this deck for your purposes, feel free. There are some flex cards they can tweak to your liking. I included 2 paywalls in this deck because Employee Strike, I believe, is a thorn in the neck for this deck, really. You do rely on your economy operations a lot to get you enough money to res the likes of DNA Tracker and Firewall. So getting denied on money is a big no-no. And paywall clears that, and it's secondarily a transaction as well, which synergizes with BABW's ability even in matchups where you are not expecting employee strike. The agenda suite can also be tweaked. Armored Servers was my one-off agenda, but it could easily be a sales team. It's basically a worse version of Nisei Mark II. The 5-3 can also be swapped around. If you want to free up the restricted slot for a Hunter Seeker, or if you want to free up the influence for something else, swap the global foods for a Graft. Graft is a very powerful agenda when scored. It gives you more scoring targets early on, and you also regain the influence, which you can then spend on defensive upgrades, which is something this deck is glaringly lacking. Unlike most other Glacier decks, there's no defensive upgrade in this deck, meaning that a runner who generates enough income to run your remote every turn will have you on lock. Upgrades will help you save your beyoken in case of that. You can spend your influence on the likes of Marcus Patty and Ash. So yep, those are some tips. Feel free to play around with the deck. I think it is a deck that you cannot go wrong with. While it isn't the most powerful deck of the day, I think it will be a pretty suitable deck to spot at a game night kit. Thanks for watching, and I hope you'll have fun with this deck. I'll see you next time.